that what is going to happen here is the creation of a new government that is going to terminate in either monarchy or aristocracy. Too much power is being concentrated in this federal government too far away from the people who make up the nation. So George Mason of Virginia, who attends the convention but refuses to sign the Constitution, says, this government will set out as a moderate aristocracy. It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will in its operation produce a monarchy or a corrupt tyrannical aristocracy. It will most probably vibrate for some years between the two and then terminate in one or the other. Notice that language, right out of Montesquieu, right? The monarchy, the tyranny, the aristocracy, and so forth. James Lincoln, the South Carolina anti-federalist. What have you been contending for these 10 years past? Liberty. What is liberty? The power of governing yourselves. If you adopt this Constitution, will you have that power? No. You will give it into the hands of a set of men who live 1,000 miles distant from it, right? By creating this federal government that is going to have this power over the states and individual citizens. George Clinton, governor of New York, and a staunch anti-federalist, ultimately became vice president for, I believe it was Jefferson and Madison. The new capital city that is going to be created by the federal government, for the creation of Washington, D.C., which you alluded to in your comments, Betsy, will become, quote, the asylum of the base, idle, avaricious, and ambitious. It says everything except K Street, right? But this is why I think we should read the Anti-Federalists as well as the Federalists. You know, this guy is pretty insightful in that regard. Now, there's actually a fair amount of debate. Actually, I'll save that for last. There's a fair amount of debate that goes on among historians that really has gone on over the last century over the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And do we best explain the divisions between them in terms of ideology? That they disagreed over ideas, or do we best explain the differences between them in terms of economic interests? That this was, different types of property owners clashing with each other in the way that Federalist number 10 tries to explain. And the most famous historian to start this debate was a guy named Charles Beard, who wrote in the early 20th century. He was a historian at Columbia University. He wrote a book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. And what he did was he knocked the Founding Fathers off their pedestal. And he said this wasn't about rescuing the revolution from anarchy and disunion and so forth. This was about a minority of propertied men subverting the revolution in order to put in place a federal government that was designed to protect certain types of property that they held. Slaves, Western lands that the federal government claimed ownership of across the Appalachian Mountains. Continental securities. These were the creditors of the federal government. These were the people who had bought up all those continental securities that paid for the revolution. They wanted that debt to be paid off. Land speculators, financial men, slaveholders. That was the Beard thesis. And it had a big impact. And a lot of people still pretty much believe that. Another historian came along in the 1950s and sat down and actually did a very close analysis of the economic backgrounds and interests of every delegate at every ratification convention in the States. And guess what he found out? No direct correlation between the economic background of the people in the ratification conventions and the way they voted for the Constitution. So that would seem to be an argument for ideological differences rather than economic differences. This is a debate historians will have for a very, very long time. And every now, it's always being reinterpreted in this way. But generally speaking, that's how it falls. If you're somebody of who lionizes the Founding Fathers, the James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, Moses-like came down from the mountain with the Constitution carved on the stone tablets, then you're somebody who argues that it was the Constitution that saved America from disaster. If you're somebody who's a little suspicious about these historical figures, somebody who points out that people like Madison were slaveholders after all. George Washington was a slaveholder. You point out that these were the richest men in this society who basically held a secret meeting and then foisted upon the populace this government, then you're somebody who's a Beardian. You're somebody who believes that it was ultimately economic interest that was driving it. The Anti-Federalists, what are we doing on time? We got started a little late, so I've got about 5 minutes here. The Anti-Federalist argument, I just want to spend just a little bit talking about the Anti-Federalists. Their argument centered on a few key points, just like the Federalist Papers did. First was representation. Anti-Federalists believed that the problem of the new government was that it was not representative enough, that there was no way that this new federal government was going to be able to represent the true interests of the people, because it simply was too small to do that. As the Constitution was originally drafted, the electoral districts for the House of Representatives were supposed to be 1 representative for every 35,000 people. And that was simply too large. People couldn't be duly represented. Now it's, I believe, 1 representative for every 650,000. Right? So they would be shocked, at the world we live in today. But their point was, when you make big electoral districts, only the wealthy and well-known are going to be able to get elected to office. Your humble farmer, your humble tradesman, is not going to have the resources to get himself elected to office when there's a famous war hero or a very prominent slave owner or landowner, somebody like that, who's going to get elected to office. Secondly, the Anti-Federalists believed in separation of powers too. Their issue with this Constitution was there wasn't enough separation of powers. And in particular, there was not enough separation of powers between the presidency and the Senate. These were, of course, the innovations, a new executive branch and a new upper house in the federal Congress. And according to the Anti-Federalists, it would not take long for this very small group of men, the President and the Senate, which is only going to be 26 members, to control the entire federal government. Because look at what the Constitution has in it regarding the powers of the President and the Senate. Between the two of them, they are going to control all federal nominations and appointments, especially to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is going to be the toady of the President and the Senate. They are going to have control over impeachment. They are going to have control over diplomacy and treaty making. The Constitution says treaties are going to be the supreme law of the land. Well, who negotiates treaties? The executive branch. Who approves them? The Senate. What's the House of Representatives have to say about it? Absolutely nothing. Okay? So this is clearly an attack on the representative powers of the House of Representatives and the interests of the people. What's going to happen is re-emergent aristocracy. The new nation's government will become the playground of the rich and powerful, as represented by that statement about the new federal capital city becoming this base for ambition and avarice. There is this concern that even though the Constitution prohibited titles of nobility being granted, that a new aristocracy was going to emerge. Look at the Senate today, and look at the House of Representatives today. The Senate has 100 members. How many of them are millionaires? Almost all of them, right? They generally represent, and look at them, just line them up against the wall. How many of them are women?
Very few.
A minority. 32? That many? Very few. Yeah, I do know. It sure ain't 50-50, right? How many of them are people of color? Even smaller number, right? It's basically a bunch of rich white guys in the Senate. Look at the House of Representatives. A much greater spectrum in terms of the net worth of the people sitting in the House of Representatives. A much greater spectrum of male and female and the different ethnicities in the United States. You have whites, you have blacks, you have Hispanics, you have all sorts of different folks in the House of Representatives. It's simply a much more representative body of the United States population in general than the Senate is. And that reflects a concern that the Anti-Federalists had. And then lastly, most importantly, the Anti-Federalists critiqued the Constitution because it lacked something very, very important, and that was the Bill of Rights. As it was originally drafted, there was no Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments. It's not ratified until 1791. The Anti-Federalists attacked the Constitution because it was giving all this power to this new federal government to act directly on the citizens, and yet it was not guaranteeing some basic civil liberties that Americans had fought and died for in the American Revolution. What does Alexander Hamilton say about that? In Federalist number 84, Hamilton says, a Bill of Rights would be redundant because the Constitution already guarantees certain civil liberties to the citizens, like the right of habeas corpus, can't be held indefinitely.